Everyone thinks Apple got lucky with the M1. They didn't. What actually happened is way stranger and way more calculated than anyone gives them credit for. For 40 years, every single computer on planet Earth ran on the same basic blueprint. Intel's x86 architecture, born in 1978, was the law of the land. It didn't matter if you were building a gaming rig, a business laptop, or a Mac. You played by Intel's rules. And then in 2020, Apple looked at that 40-year foundation and just walked away from it. No warning shots, no slow transition. They ripped the engine out of every future Mac and replaced it with something the entire industry had already tried and failed with. Twice. Here's the part that should terrify every tech executive reading this right now. Apple didn't invent anything new. They took a chip architecture that Microsoft already tried and abandoned, that Qualcomm already tried and abandoned, that Samsung, HP, and Asus all quietly buried after their own failed attempts. ARM chips. Reduced instruction set processors that were supposed to be the future of efficient computing and instead became a graveyard of dead products nobody remembers. The Surface RT. Anyone? Exactly. Nobody remembers it because it flopped so hard Microsoft basically pretended it never happened. So why did Apple succeed where literally every single competitor face-planted? Because Apple wasn't actually starting from zero. That's the twist nobody talks about enough. While Intel was busy chasing higher and higher clock speeds throughout the 2000s, cramming more raw power into desktop chips and hoping nobody would notice the heat problem, Apple was quietly building an entirely different muscle. In 2010, they dropped the A4 chip into the iPhone 4 and the original iPad, and on the surface, that looks like a completely separate story. A phone chip has nothing to do with a laptop chip, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. Because building a chip for a phone forces you to solve a problem that desktop manufacturers never had to care about. You have almost no battery. You have almost no room for a cooling fan. You cannot just brute force your way to better performance by cranking up the wattage. You are forced from day one to get obsessed with squeezing maximum performance out of minimum power. That obsession is the entire story. That's the hidden decade nobody factors in when they talk about the M1 like it appeared out of nowhere in 2020. It didn't appear out of nowhere. It was 10 years of iPhone chip development wearing a laptop costume, and here's where it gets genuinely wild. Around the release of the iPhone 12, a YouTuber named Jonathan Morrisons ran a test that should have been embarrassing for Apple. He put a top-tier Intel iMac up against an iPhone 12 mini in a video rendering test. We're talking a 10-core i9 processor, 64 gigabytes of RAM, a machine that cost thousands of dollars and was, on paper, an absolute monster, against a phone, a literal smartphone that fits in your pocket. And even giving that iMac a head start, the iPhone finished the render first. Let that sink in for a second. Apple's phone chip was outperforming their own flagship desktop computer running Intel Silicon. Now, to be fair, and I want to be honest here because the internet loves to strip nuance out of stuff like this, part of that was Apple's dedicated media engine, doing heavy lifting on video encoding specifically. It wasn't a pure raw CPU versus CPU showdown. But honestly, that caveat almost makes the story more damning for Intel, not less. Because it means Apple wasn't just chasing faster cores. They were engineering entire systems, top to bottom, around how people actually use these devices in real life. Intel was still playing the old game. Apple had already moved on to a completely different sport. So Apple is sitting there in the late 20-teens with a problem that should be a good problem to have, but was actually deeply embarrassing. Their phones were making their own laptops look bad. Think about how insane that sentence is for a second. The device you carry in your jeans pocket was starting to outclass the device sitting on your desk that costs 3 or 4 times as much. That's the moment Apple decides to go all in. Now here's where every previous ARM failure becomes relevant again, because this is the exact spot where Microsoft, Qualcomm, and Samsung all crashed and burned before. It was never really about the hardware being weak. ARM chips were genuinely efficient. The problem was software. In 2020, every single piece of software running on a Mac, we're talking Photoshop, Chrome, professional CAD programs, 20 straight years of applications. All of it was built specifically for Intel's x86 architecture. Apple was preparing to launch a brand new laptop that, on paper, could not run a single piece of existing software people actually needed. That is the exact same cliff that killed the Surface RT. Beautiful hardware, incredible battery life claims, and then you turn it on and half your programs just don't work. This is where Apple pulls out the move that genuinely separates them from every failed attempt before them. Rosetta. A dynamic translation layer that let old Intel-built apps run on the brand new M1 chip, while developers scrambled to build native versions. It wasn't a perfect fix. It was a bridge. But it was the exact bridge that Microsoft never built for Windows on ARM, and it's the reason the M1 launch didn't turn into a slow-motion disaster. And then you stack on top of that the fact that Apple controls literally everything in the stack. The chip, the operating system, the developer tools. Nobody else on the planet has that kind of vertical control. Microsoft makes Windows but doesn't make the chips most PCs run on. Qualcomm makes chips but doesn't control the operating system layer sitting on top. Apple was the only company on Earth positioned to pull this specific move off, because they weren't negotiating with 3 different companies to make the pieces fit. They were just making decisions internally and shipping them. So what actually is the M1, mechanically speaking? Because this part matters, and it's where a lot of the internet conversation gets sloppy. The M1 is what's called a system on a chip. That means the CPU, the GPU, the RAM, the input-output controllers, the neural engine for machine learning tasks, the video codec hardware. All of it lives on one single piece of silicon. On a traditional PC, these are separate components scattered across a motherboard, constantly shipping data back and forth between different chips like passing notes across a classroom. On the M1, they're not passing notes. They're sitting next to each other whispering directly. That's the unified memory architecture people keep bringing up, and it's not just marketing language. The CPU and GPU are literally looking at the exact same pool of memory instead of copying data between 2 separate memory banks. That reduces latency in a way that traditional architecture straight up cannot replicate without a total redesign. The result of stacking all of these decisions on top of each other, the decade of iPhone chip R&D, the Rosetta bridge, the vertical integration, the unified memory, is a chip that got labeled the best performance per watt processor on the planet. Not the fastest chip in raw numbers necessarily, the most efficient at converting electricity into actual usable performance. And that distinction matters more than people realize, because performance per watt is the metric that determines battery life, heat, fan noise, and honestly the entire feel of using a laptop day to day. Now let's talk about the fallout. Because this is where the story stops being about Apple and starts being about the entire industry getting rattled awake. Intel didn't just lose a customer when Apple walked. They lost a symbol. Wall Street analysts estimated Intel's annual revenue took a hit somewhere between $2.7 and $4 billion after the breakup. That's not pocket change for anybody, even a company Intel's size. And the deeper wound wasn't even the dollar figure. It was the message it sent to the entire market. If Apple, the most demanding hardware company on the planet, decided your architecture wasn't good enough anymore, what does that say to everyone else quietly watching? Here's a prediction floating around that should make Windows users sit up straight. Analysts are projecting that by 2029, 40% of all laptops sold could be running ARM-based chips instead of traditional x86. 40%. That's not a niche trend anymore. That's a fundamental shift in the entire market's foundation. and it traces directly back to Apple proving the concept could actually work in the real world instead of just on a slide deck. And then there's the twist almost nobody saw coming. AMD, Intel's biggest x86 rival, is rumored to be quietly developing their own ARM-based system on a chip. Think about the irony baked into that sentence for a second. The company that spent years fighting Intel on Intel's own turf might end up abandoning that turf entirely, chasing the exact strategy Apple pioneered. But the wildest move in this entire saga, the one that genuinely surprised me the most, is NVIDIA. This is a company that built its entire trillion-dollar reputation on graphics cards, on raw parallel processing power for gaming and now artificial intelligence. And this year, Jensen Huang, wearing that leather jacket he apparently never takes off, unveiled RTX Spark, an ARM-based system on a chip platform built specifically for Windows laptops and compact PCs. The biggest graphics card company on Earth is now building CPUs using the exact philosophy Apple validated with the M1. If that doesn't tell you the ARM shift is real and permanent, I genuinely don't know what will. And Microsoft, the same company that got humiliated by the Surface RT over a decade ago, is now going all in on Windows on ARM. They released Windows 11 version 26H1 specifically optimized for ARM processors, expanding support across a much wider range of chips than their previous half-hearted attempts. It took them over a decade and a very public failure to circle back around and finally commit. But they're committing now. Here's the controversial part, and I want to say this clearly, because the comment sections on every Apple Silicon video always erupt over this exact point. There's a heated argument about whether RISC architecture, the family ARM belongs to, is actually inherently superior to CISC, the family x86 belongs to. One side insists RISC has always been the objectively better design, pointing back to old PowerPC chips beating higher clocked Intel processors decades ago. The other side pushes back hard, arguing that modern x86 chips already function like RISC processors internally, with a translation layer bolted on top for backward compatibility, and that the real gap between Apple and Intel wasn't really about instruction sets at all. It was about Intel getting stuck on an outdated 14-nanometer manufacturing process for roughly 7 straight years, from 2014 to 2020, while competitors like TSMC and Samsung raced ahead to 10-nanometer and then 7-nanometer chips. If that argument holds water, Apple's advantage wasn't really architectural purity. It was manufacturing execution combined with a decade of mobile efficiency research that Intel simply never had a reason to prioritize. I'll be honest with you, I think both sides are grabbing half the truth and calling it the whole picture. Architecture matters, manufacturing process matters, and Apple's insane level of vertical control matters just as much as either of those factors individually. Pretending it's just one clean explanation flattens a genuinely complicated engineering story into a soundbite. There's another debate worth sitting with here, and it's less about the technology and more about what this entire shift actually costs consumers long-term. Because when everything gets soldered directly onto one chip, RAM, storage, processor, all fused together for that speed and efficiency advantage, you lose the ability to upgrade or repair individual components down the road. That efficiency comes with a real trade-off. You're buying a sealed box. If one part fails or becomes outdated, you're not swapping a stick of memory. You're replacing the entire machine. Some people see that as Apple perfecting the art of planned obsolescence dressed up in premium marketing language. Others argue the performance and battery life gains are worth that sacrifice. I don't think there's a clean right answer here, and honestly, anyone who tells you there is probably trying to sell you something. Even Apple itself just took this philosophy to its most extreme conclusion yet, and this might be the detail that surprises casual observers the most. The new MacBook Neo doesn't even use one of the traditional M-series chips people associate with the Apple Silicon revolution. It ships with the A18 Pro, the exact same chip found inside an iPhone. 5 years ago, the idea of selling a laptop powered by a literal phone processor would have sounded like a joke. A downgrade, a gimmick destined to flop. Instead, it's reportedly breaking sales records right now. Sit with that for a second, because it means the entire premise of what separates a phone from a computer is dissolving in real time, and most people haven't fully clocked how significant that actually is yet. So where does that leave the rest of the industry standing right now, staring down this shift that started with one keynote in 2020? Intel is scrambling to rebuild credibility after essentially a decade of stagnation, throwing renewed focus toward power efficiency, especially as data center energy costs become an increasingly brutal line item for their remaining customers. AMD appears to be hedging its bets, allegedly exploring the exact ARM strategy that Apple proved viable, even though AMD's own x86 chips have made genuinely impressive efficiency gains recently that get less attention than they probably deserve. NVIDIA is no longer content staying in its graphics card lane and is actively muscling into CPU territory with an approach that borrows directly from Apple's playbook. Microsoft is finally, after one very public and humiliating failure a decade ago, putting real weight behind Windows on ARM instead of treating it like an afterthought nobody in Redmond really believed in. And Apple, the company that started this entire chain reaction, isn't slowing down or looking back even for a second. They're pushing further into blurring the line between phone and computer with every single new release. So here's the real question worth sitting with after all of this. If a phone chip can now legitimately outperform machines that used to require massive desktop towers just a few short years ago, what exactly still makes a laptop anymore? And if the answer keeps shrinking every single year, how much longer until the device sitting in your pocket right now quietly becomes the only computer you'll ever actually need to own?
If you enjoy this video, please like, share, subscribe and hit the bell to the later update from my channel. Thank you for watching till the end and see you in the next video.